Question: are you familiar with the term tech debt? Do you believe the tech debt in your project is because of the bad code you wrote? Or alternatively, do you believe the tech debt in your project is because of the tech your project is built with? People, I hate tech debt. And because of that, I hate boilerplate, I hate over-engineering, and I love clean code. When I look at a piece of code again and again, and after a reasonable amount of time, I'm not confident I know what it's doing. I get nervous. It means I'm probably not going to be able to maintain it. The only reliable way I've found to make code more maintainable is to remove it. My professional career has been centered around web development. But to be more specific, I've been building large apps with React. It's fun. Writing React is enjoyable and rewarding. There's a lot of charming features to it. Components, JSX, hooks, state, context, memoization, and effects. When React is done right, you end up writing clean, well-structured front ends that scale and meet your needs. When it's done right. Last year, I was convinced to try out Angular, and it too had its charms. I built a few small apps and discovered some interesting things. Coming from React, it was a breath of fresh air. I'm not saying it was better, but no hooks, context, memoization, or effects. All that machinery I thought was an absolute necessity because of my prior experience wasn't necessary in this framework. But boy, there is a lot going on in Angular. The life cycle is complicated, to say the least. I kept asking myself, which hook do I use? When do I use the others? What's with all the decorators? Why do I need to do all this inheritance for seemingly simple tasks? React doesn't have this, so is it really necessary? It's true, React and Angular are different. In fact, they're polar opposites. And when you start playing around with either or coming from the other, at some point, you're going to end up asking yourself, what's with all this extra funky stuff? Why do I need use effect or use state? Why is the Angular template so involved? Why is React so slow? Why is Angular even slower? And why are my bundles so big? This made me think, no matter what framework I choose for a project, I'm just going to have to suck it up and deal with the vast amount of boilerplate that comes with said framework, and there's no way around it. But I didn't like that. So I went down the proverbial JavaScript rabbit hole to learn the differences between many well-established, intriguing JavaScript frameworks to figure out which ones have the better overall development experience. Because I'm a developer, and I am of the mind that the better the developer experience, the better the product. This meant I got accustomed with React, Angular, Vue, Solid.js, Astro, Next.js, Remix, and after all of that, circled back to vanilla JavaScript, and then I tried it all again with TypeScript. But I wasn't satisfied. And then I found Svelte. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my rant, the framework without the framework. Having all this exposure to different frameworks gave me perspective into the knots people get themselves into when they clan up with their framework of choice. I love React, but I'm in use effect hell. I'm an Angular bro, but I have to use this Angular wrapper thing to do something I thought would be simpler. Let's look at an example of what I'm talking about. We're going to build this, the quintessential counter. It's an ordinary component that maintains a counter, the value of that counter doubled, and a button to increment that value by 1. Yes, this is the toy example, but there are important concepts here, such as reactive state, computed values, and event handling. And I'm going to show you just how unnecessarily complicated something as simple as what you see here has become in modern frameworks. As I go through this elementary example, I want you to keep in mind, if something as simple as a counter can be so verbose, how does it scale out to a real-world app? We'll start with the React implementation. Here we can see we are grabbing some resources from the React library. Then we've got our component declaration. We have the state initialization, our computed value double count, and a little bit of mockup to actually render the component. Immediately off the bat, we can identify boilerplate. Oh, and when I say boilerplate, I am being very liberal with the term. That is, anything that could have been abstracted away from me as the developer. First, the imports. Second, the function declaration line. Third, the array destructuring, the setter, and the useState hook. Fourth, the useMemo hook and the count dependency array. Fifth, the return and the fragment. Some of you might say, this isn't boilerplate. This is just how React works. But this is my talk, so humor me. All of these things have a reason in React. It's true. React has reinforced that all of this is fine. But what if React abstracted this away from us and instead did this behind the scenes? What I'm saying is, what does React look like without boilerplate? Well, it's rather odd, and it looks something like this. Okay, so before any React devs in the audience try to shoot me in the face, I know this isn't valid code, but there is a point which I'll get to eventually. We've removed the React ornamentation, and we now have something a lot more readable. We have a variable count, a variable double count, the increment function, and a block of markup. The problem here is that double count doesn't seem like it'll update when count is updated. Its value won't automatically synchronize with updates on the count variable. We'll figure that one out later. This is not valid React code, but optimally, React could look something like this. We've removed the boilerplate, and immediately we've created a friendlier tool. Let's do the same for Angular. Here we have the same component, just written in Angular. Again, we're grabbing some resources from the Angular library, adding some metadata with the decorator. We have a block of markup to render the component, a class to represent the logic of our component, and some state and functions that get used by the template. Pretty simple, but there is boilerplate. So let's identify it. Number 1, the import. Number 2, the decorator. Number 3, the selector. Number 4, the class declaration. Number 5, the dreaded JavaScript this keyword. And number 6, we have some odd things going on in the template. So as in the React example, let's see what Angular would look like if it too were boilerplate free. Again, before any Angular devs attempt my murder, bear with me. There is a reason for this butchery of framework code. So let's have a look at what I did. I kept the selector because Angular components rely on this feature. So let's just leave it there. I also pushed the logic to the top of the file because it made sense for it to be above the template. This is not Angular code, but optimally, Angular could look like this. We've removed the boilerplate, and immediately we've created a friendlier tool. Angular became friendlier. Angular became more maintainable. If we contrast this to the refined version of React earlier, they're quite similar. So what if we could do this? What if we could do better than the inefficient tools we use today? Prune out the tech debt from our frameworks and bring together the good to make something boilerplate free. Enter Vue. Vue is awesome. Vue is fresh. I admit, I am not a Vue expert. I just keep up with what's happening. Here's what Vue did. It learned. It looked at React and said, this is cool. You've got some interesting ideas, but I think I can do it better. Vue then looked at Angular and thought, well, that's just sad. Vue took the ideas put forth by frameworks of the time, refined them, and became a clean tool. It made code more concise, and ultimately, it made code more maintainable. Let's have a look at the counter component from earlier, but this time in Vue. The first thing that comes to my mind when looking at this code is that it is less code than its React and Angular counterparts. But I still have some issues with it, so let me point them out. 1. The setup prop on the enclosing script. The imports again. I mean really, we're in a .view file. Can the core dependencies of Vue not be auto-included at build time? 3. The ref and the computed usage. 4. This .value thing in the script, but not in the template. And 5. The template tag, the must-off syntax, and the @ symbol. All of this is required by Vue. But let's entertain the idea that Vue did just a little bit more for us. Pretty readable, right? If Vue looked like this, we'd all be fools to not be using it. At this point, you might be noticing something interesting. When you remove the framework complexities from the counter components in the React, Angular, and Vue examples, they converge. They start to look similar. It's almost as if there is an underlying syntax or even language these frameworks are attempting to approximate, but are simply failing at. So we've seen Vue's not perfect. It is clean and the better of the three, but there are a few more pain points. It's less opinionated, which at first sounds like a good thing, but this means that two Vue apps on different ends of the world could look completely different, whereas almost all Angular apps look, feel, and function the same. And so Angular skills are easily transferable between projects. The same can't be said for Vue. Vue also ships a sizable bundle, not as big as React and not nearly as big as Angular, but not small enough to make a difference to the client. As engineers, this overhead we've gotten comfortable with should annoy us. It should bother us. It should even offend us. It should be removed, and we've shown at a high level that it can be. We should want better, and we should demand better. A side note, from here on out, I will be referring to React, Angular, and Vue as the three musketeers, given they're often grouped together when it comes to front-end development. The inherent problem with the three musketeers is reactivity. What is reactivity? Simply put, reactivity is keeping your UI in sync with your internal state. Simple, right? Well, it's more complicated than it sounds because reactivity was never JavaScript's goal. Whoops, not Mocha, JavaScript. JavaScript was meant to make the web interactive, and ever since, JavaScript has been bent and broken to make the web reactive. Where React and Vue use the virtual DOM to achieve reactivity, Angular, the poor thing, eventually figures out it should just re-render the entire page as soon as you move your mouse. In the words of John Lindquist, React is a terrible name for React. I would bundle Angular and Vue in that as well. It's as if the tools we've decided to stand by are just about good enough, and so we don't feel the need to move on to something better because our current situation is okay, even though we'd be better off changing things up. There's a term for this. It's called the region beta paradox. Imagine you live 2 kilometers from work. That isn't far, so you decide you're going to walk. You're a normal human being, so your speed is about 5 kilometers per hour. So it'll take you 24 minutes or so to get to work. I did the math beforehand, it checks out. 24 minutes is okay, I guess. Almost half an hour to get to work, even though you stay 2 kilometers away, is a bit much, but it's not terrible. But what if you stayed 4 kilometers from work? You still walk the same speed, and so it'll take you round about 48 minutes. Almost an hour without the return trip? That's a bit much for just 4 kilometers. So you decide, no, tomorrow I'm going to drive my car. And the next day, it takes you 5 minutes to get to work. You moved further away from work, but you ended up gaining a chunk of your day back. You were better off making the move than you would have been without it. Currently, the front-end developer using either of the three musketeers is the one staying 2 kilometers from work, taking nearly 30 minutes to get there. My goal here is to help that developer take that leap. Make the move so you're all the better for it. Let us all learn something new to make our lives better. Introducing Svelte. Spelled S-V-E-L-T-E. It's a real word. It means slender, fast, lithe, sleek, attractively thin, elegant, and energetic. When you hear the word Svelte, I don't want you to think of this. I want you to think of this. Attractively thin, elegant, and fast. Svelte is the modern way to build web apps. First released in 2016 by Rich Harris, a graphics editor at the New York Times. Version 2 came out 2 years later, and version 3 2 years after that in 2020. This is when people really started taking Svelte seriously. Version 4 came out this year. Version 5 is slated to come out within 12 months. So why? Why Svelte? Well, unlike the Three Musketeers, Svelte isn't a runtime dependency you ship with the code you write. It's a compiler. What that means is, when you write Svelte, you write vanilla JavaScript and HTML and CSS without any of the boilerplate, and the Svelte compiler compiles your code, giving you the reactivity for free. Svelte adds in the complexities for you during the build phase, so you never have to think about it. This allows you to write code that looks like the simplified versions of the counters we created earlier. It makes your life easier, and it makes your code cleaner. It makes your mind do less of the work and hands the stress of reactivity off to the compiler. Contrast this to what normal frameworks do. They too have a build step, but it's different. When you run npm run build in one of the Three Musketeers, your framework code just gets transformed into a standard version of JavaScript for cross-browser support. Then the framework dependencies get plugged in, then minification occurs, and that's it. Nothing gets added in for you during the build. Because Svelte is a compiler, the complexities no longer sit with the developer. It's a fundamental shift in how our code actually works, and that's why it's performant, clean, minimal, and oh so simple. Let's do the same thing we did with Three Musketeers earlier, but this time with a Svelte counter. Here we have a normal variable count. We have this dollar thing, and then a variable doubled, which is count times 2. We'll get back to the dollar. We have an increment function which increases count by 1. And then we have our markup. This is Svelte, and this is a fair amount more readable than the Three Musketeers. So is there even boilerplate here? Well, for one, as in Vue, we have a script tag that's enclosing our JavaScript. And second, the dollar we spoke about earlier. Let's take some time to see why these two features are needed and what happens to the code quality when we remove it. There are two problems with this pseudocode. The first being that we now have loose JavaScript. And so what happens if I took this function on line 4 and put it below the button on line 10? Well, it would look like this. And now we have JavaScript above and below our markup, which doesn't seem like a good idea at all. So we want the script tag. We like the script tag. Let's put it back in. The second problem is the doubled variable. With this current code, let's trace what happens when the user clicks the button. At first, count is set to 0, and doubled is set to count times 2, aka 0 times 2, which is just 0. So when the user clicks the button, the onClick event runs the increment function, which increases count by 1. But what about doubled? Did doubled recalculate? Well, it doesn't seem like it, right? It's just a normal variable, and we have no reason to believe it would recalculate. So doubled will still be 0. Does this mean we have to add doubled equals count times 2 again in the increment function? No, that's horrible, and it won't scale the more complex this gets. It's repeated code, and we don't want that. What we want is a way of telling Svelte that doubled is reactive. That is, whenever count changes, recalculate doubled with a new value of count. Where React uses the memo hook, Angular a function, and Vue the computed property, Svelte has the nifty dollar. This is how Svelte runs code when its dependencies change. Just like that, Svelte replaced 3 React hooks, 2 Angular lifecycle hooks, and 2 Vue properties, all in one. Contrast the Svelte implementation to the 3 Musketeers. It's trivial to see that Svelte is by far the most readable and easy to understand. And if you recall the simplified boilerplate-free versions of the 3 counters we wrote earlier, you'll see they approximate Svelte. And my point here is that your framework is already Svelte. It's just really, really bad Svelte. It's got all this clutter around it that you don't need, and it's your choice if you want to keep writing it or not. So that was cute. Svelte has potential, right? Right, it does have potential, but I'm not here to show you Svelte has potential. I'm here to show you Svelte isn't the small dog anymore. Svelte is production ready. More production ready, in my opinion, than React. This coming from someone who writes React every day and gets paid for it. I won't speak to the others because I have not used them in production, but I have my opinion, and I think they all have their issues. So what can Svelte do? Let's go through some of Svelte's features and a few of the design decisions the framework made. Svelte created its own templating syntax, which sometimes isn't immediately well received, but once you start using it, you realize it's quite intuitive. An if block starts with a $if and ends with a /if. If you want to chain it with else statements, you can use the continuation syntax with :else. The pound starts a logic block, the colon continues it, and the / ends it. Svelte also provides the each logic block to loop over lists. Just as in the if block, the list block begins with a $each and ends with a /each. The templating features go further with support for asynchronous values, aka promises. Svelte offers you syntax to await your promises inside the template and handle the positive and negative cases intuitively. Server-side rendering was popular back in the days of PHP, though declined when apps built with the 3 Musketeers took over. But the front-end server has made quite the resurgence in the past few years, as frameworks are now just shipping too much JavaScript to the client. If you want to ship even less JavaScript to the client than you already have just by choosing Svelte, you can. It's one line. Servers also aren't everyone's choice on how to do front ends, and that's completely fine. If you just want static assets, you can throw in object storage and have a cloud provider serve it up at the edge for you. All you need to do is set it up in your config. Who's worked on a serious app that didn't have to do any styling? Nobody. Good. It's important for a framework to think about CSS from the get-go, and Svelte went one step further and scoped it for you by default. This is probably my favorite feature and the reason I fell in love with Svelte. Have you ever wanted to slide an element into your page when the user does something? Or make a modal fade in with a subtle little bounce effect? Yeah, me too, but it's involved. Being able to animate state change is not something the 3 Musketeers make easy to do. In fact, Vue was the only one to bother supporting it. That's because applying state animation changes can be done easily enough with conditional CSS classes in React and Angular. But it's hairy and feels like a hack, so Svelte did better. On line 11, you can see the property transition slide on the p tag. And what that means is, when the visible flag changes, the p tag is going to slide in and out of the DOM, instead of harshly just disappearing and reappearing. I was one of those that resisted file-based routing in the beginning. Why should I do it? I can just maintain an object in my code that maps routes to components. But I was wrong. File-based routing means the project structure becomes predictable. It means that Svelte App 1 in South Africa, for example, and Svelte App 2 in Brazil look the same and feel the same. In my opinion, it is the option that scales. Svelte also has built-in TypeScript support, though it is opt-in. In the American market, TypeScript has really taken over as the way to build front-ends. Domestically, this idea hasn't quite taken as well. But I'm sure within the next few years, South African developers will realize TypeScript means maintainability and predictability, especially as developers rotate in and out of teams. A little bit of a hot take: if you're not using TypeScript on your front ends, you're making a mistake. Another cool feature is that you don't just need to write markup, but markdown too. Just add the package and you're good to go. This is a huge win for rapidly writing out content-heavy pages in your web app. And lastly, built-in state management. It's refreshing to know that a framework really thought of everything and was meticulous about making the developer experience butter smooth from day one. Svelte gives you this first-class feature called stores for managing state across your application. There are many more features of Svelte that have made my life easier as a developer, but if I went through them all now, we'd be here all day. I think the better question to ask is, what can't Svelte do? Well, for one, it doesn't allow more than one component profile. That's good. You shouldn't be doing that. And second, the editor support isn't crazy. You can use VS Code, WebStorm, IntelliJ, Vim, and Project IDX, Google's new browser-based AI-assisted development environment. Something that was on this list a few years ago was Svelte had a small ecosystem, but that's not the case anymore. There are new libraries popping up weekly, and probably daily at this point. I've even created my own, Hot UI, an opinionated Tailwind CSS-based Svelte component library. But I don't really know what I'm doing, and I could probably use a hand or two. So the bottom line is, Svelte is ready. It can be used in the real world. We don't know this because I'm saying this. We know this because companies all over the world are building small to massive applications with it and adopting incrementally. To list a few: IBM, Spotify, Cloudflare, the NBA, Apple Music, Yelp.com, the Brave browser, the New York Times, and IKEA. But even closer to home, BBD Software is looking for Svelte developers. BBD, don't believe me? Check these two posts from BBD's socials recruiting front-end engineers. On the left, under technical know-how, React, Angular, Vue, and Svelte. And there in the top right, are you a passionate JavaScript engineer with strong exposure and experience in tech such as Angular, React, Vue, and Svelte? Ha! Svelte. BBD and other international companies are now not just listing React, Angular, and Vue for front-end development skills, but Svelte too. Ladies and gentlemen, the three musketeers are no more. Introducing the fourth musketeer. And number 4 is my number 1 recommendation. So I think it's time to explain the title. What is this framework without a framework business? Well, traditionally, front-end apps work like this. You write your application using your framework. You then build and minify your source code, which generates static assets that include your framework. You give that to your server, and your server gives it to the client. So what ends up happening is your client gets 2 blocks of JavaScript, your code and the runtime dependency, aka the framework. Svelte is much the same, except for one key difference. It takes your code, and because Svelte is a compiler, in the build step it compiles your code, genuinely compiles your code into framework-free JavaScript. This means that in your static assets, Svelte is not present. The framework is not present. And so now you're only giving your client 1 block of frameworkless JavaScript, and it's a mere fraction of the size compared to the rest of the musketeers because of this one rather simple but powerful change. JavaScript optimized for reactivity, the framework without a framework. I know at this point it might be seeming like your framework of choice is inferior. Honestly, you're probably right, but that doesn't mean it's the wrong choice. Your framework is well established. Your team is familiar with it, and you've had success in the past with it. So the decision to use it is justified. It gets the job done and is pretty good at what it does. React, Angular, and Vue are all tremendous innovations in front-end development and have ultimately made front-end more enjoyable and more accessible. If you like your framework, I think you should use it. If you're like me and prefer your grass a little greener, a little less, why does this instantly feel like tech debt? You should give Svelte a try. You don't even have to create an app to get your feet wet. Just try their REPL. It's available on their website where this QR code takes you to. If you want to learn Svelte, they've got an awesome tutorial. After 20 minutes of following it, I already knew enough to build what I want. To close off,